brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the panel. Iraq 5 years on, stability or chaos. I am Ehtisham Hibatullah, the panel moderator today. I have to pass on the apologies from quite a few of our speakers, unfortunately. The first is Dr. Iyad al-Allawi, who is the first prime minister after the occupation, who became very critical of the current Iraq regime and American occupation. And he really wanted to be part of this panel. Unfortunately, because of his engagement in Iraq, and he couldn't make it, so I'm conveying his apology. In addition, the Iraqi, Salah al-Sheikhi, due to personal reasons, he couldn't make it, as well as Andrew Murray, the chair of the Stop the War Coalition, due to some other urgent events that he had to go, he couldn't make it today. Let me introduce the panel to the audience. Far left is Jonathan Steele. I'm sure that you all have read the beautiful, wonderful articles on international affairs. He's the senior correspondent of Guardian. He's an expert and an analyst in the Middle Eastern affairs, especially on Iraq. The latest book, just been released, just one word to describe it, the defeat. So it says it all. I mean, how the Britain, America, and its allies got it completely wrong in Iraq. So that's his book, which has been illustrating a whole of his experience and his analysis and what he has foresaw before the war and what has happened since. So that's Jonathan Steele. Then we have George Galloway. I'm sure that many have introduced him as a person needs no introduction. But I need to say that he's a person stood up against the aggression of Iraqi people way back when the Americans were doing business with Iraqis. The Americans were selling gas to Saddam Hussein. He was protesting outside. There were very few of them. I mean, George was certainly one of them. So here we go, we have George today. And finally, that Anas al-Takriti. He's the chief executive of Cordoba Foundation and one of the architects of Islam Expo. And he is born in Iraq, in Al-Takrit, the name explains. And he has, all three panelists have a lot to give us in terms of their knowledge, either being an Iraqi or the people who's been campaigning or the following the causes for a very long time. It's not just the last few years because of the Iraq war. So I'd like to open the panel with Jonathan. He'll be briefing us for 12 to 15 minutes.
Okay, well, is this working? Yes. Yep. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here at this tremendous exhibition of Islam Expo. I've just had about 5 minutes to walk around, but I hope to have more time after this session, and it really is inspiring and encouraging that it's possible and to have such a huge exhibition in the center of London and have it so well attended. There aren't many jokes in Iraq, as you can imagine. It's not an issue on which you can express much humor. But there is one joke that I want to begin with, which was going around in Baghdad just before the current Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, had his first big meeting with George Bush, which was held in Amman in November 2006. And the joke was, what will be the demand that Bush is going to make of the Iraqis? And the answer is, when will there be a timetable for the Iraqis to leave Iraq? Now, at that stage, already 4 million Iraqis were homeless. 2 million had indeed left Iraq, and another 1.5 million or so, probably 2 million, had had to abandon their homes within Iraq and go somewhere else, a different part of the country where they felt safer. And so the joke was really referring to that, but it was, I think, referring to something else as well, which is more subtle and more significant. It was this feeling that many Iraqis have, and I think probably even more have now, that the Americans are blaming everything on what has gone in Iraq, not on themselves, but on the Iraqis. The American line is, we came in, we liberated your country, we got rid of this vicious dictator, we poured money in, US taxpayers doling out dollars, and all you can provide is what? Chaos, instability, sectarian violence, murder, rape, and no political stability in sight. And it's amazing, really, how the Americans can try and turn the tables on the people of Iraq, who they have invaded and are occupying, and imply that they are somehow to blame for the problem. Since then, of course, we've had a new guilty person being put in the dock by George Bush, and that is, of course, Iran. So if it's not the Iraqis who are responsible for the problem in Iraq, then it's the Iranians. And we've had this huge build-up in the last year or so saying that Iran is responsible for everything. Iran is funneling weapons into all kinds of militias. It's planting all these IEDs and bombs that are blowing up both Iraqi civilians and American troops. So that's the other part of the blame game. First, blame the Iraqis, and second, blame the Iranians. A little bit of blame goes to the Syrians too. I mustn't leave them out of the picture in the American view. But of course, the real problem is the occupation itself. And in this book that I've just produced called Defeat, Why They Lost Iraq, I'm really trying to challenge the conventional wisdom. I think probably few people in this hall accept it, but it is very, very dominant in the mass media in general, in Parliament, in the whole sort of sphere of punditry and all the people who analyze and talk about international affairs. And that is the argument that the Americans are responsible, yes, for some problems, and they made a series of blunders. They got rid of the Iraqi National Army unnecessarily, which not only meant there was no security force there, of course, of any kind, other than the Americans themselves, but it put something like 300,000 or 400,000 people on the street, made them unemployed, insulted them, humiliated them, because of course the Iraqi National Army was not a creation of Saddam Hussein. It long predates him, and it in many ways stood as the symbol of national pride for many Iraqis. So to assume that it was somehow a tool of Saddam Hussein and everybody in the Iraqi National Army was a fanatical supporter of Saddam and therefore the army had to be disbanded was nonsense and humiliating. The second blunder that is often said that the Americans made was that they got rid of the Ba'ath Party and then prevented anybody who'd been a senior person in the Ba'ath Party from having a managerial job. Indeed, anybody who'd been even an ordinary member of the Ba'ath Party couldn't have a top job. You couldn't be Dean of Architecture in the University of Baghdad after 2003 if you'd been a member of the Ba'ath Party, because that was a managerial job. You were, after all, in charge of all the people who were teaching architecture and studying to be architects. All the top engineering people were out if they'd been members of the Ba'ath Party. So the whole professional class, virtually, of Iraq was expelled from work and not allowed to come back. So obviously, it was very hard to get the economy functioning and services functioning. And the third argument, sometimes used in this blunder explanation of what's gone wrong, is that the Americans didn't send enough troops to Baghdad and other cities. And so this looting happened and the Americans were powerless to stop it. Well, if you'd been in Baghdad in the first days after Saddam was toppled, as I was, you would have seen there were perfectly well enough troops to stop the looting if they'd wanted to. I saw just tanks and armored personnel carriers just standing idly by and doing nothing, particularly outside the National Museum as it was being looted, and the National Library. The only ministry which they did have troops around where they did prevent crowds from going in was the Ministry of Oil. So there are these three arguments that add up to this case that the Americans made a lot of blunders and that was the problem. But if you think about this argument for a minute, it rests on one very basic assumption. What is that assumption? It is that, of course, if they hadn't made these blunders, if they'd been more intelligent, if they'd been more sensitive, if they'd been better managers, they could have had a successful occupation. Now, do we really imagine that it's possible in the 21st century for Western armies to occupy a proud Arab country on an open-ended basis without giving any timetable for withdrawal and not face opposition, resentment, anger, opposition, and ultimately resistance, including armed resistance? It wasn't until December 2006 that a high-level semi-official document, the one written by James Baker and Lee Hamilton, the so-called Lee Hamilton-Baker report, which looked at the future of options for American policy. It wasn't until that report came out that for the first time a leading document had admitted this fact, that 61% of Iraqis support armed attacks on the Americans. Until then, the image in the American media was that there was just a handful of insurgents, probably mainly foreign, who were causing all kinds of difficulties, but the broad mass of Iraqis were delighted to have Saddam gone and were delighted to have the Americans there in his place. Now they were suddenly coming to be aware of points that journalists like me and others have been making, that these attacks on the Americans have a broad base of support. 61%. I think the latest figure was about 57%. It's gone down very, very fractionally, but it's still over a majority. And of course, you can understand why. Which of the two countries that have intervened most consistently and for longest in the Middle East? Britain and the United States. So to expect Iraqis suddenly to see troops from these two countries on their streets, in those tanks, going up and down, shooting people often at checkpoints unnecessarily, innocent people, to expect that people would feel happy about that and not start wondering, why are they here? I mean, they toppled Saddam. Bush, on May the 1st, 2003, said, mission accomplished. And Iraqis would say to me, yes, mission is accomplished. We didn't particularly like Saddam. Many of them hated Saddam and were glad he was gone. But then why are the Americans and the British still here? They have accomplished their mission, if that was the mission. But of course, that wasn't the mission. The mission was much more than just toppling Saddam. It was to stay in Iraq on an open-ended basis, which they're still doing. They still haven't announced a timetable, to dominate the country, to project American power in the region, to try and threaten Iran and Syria, and of course, ultimately to have access to the enormous oil reserves of that country. And so Iraqis are rightly suspicious, and as I say, they've turned to resistance. And I think there therefore can be only one solution. It's not the only thing that has to be done, of course, but the key thing is for that occupation to end. And only then is there a real chance for Iraqis to be in charge of their destiny and to come together and to rebuild. Only then will al-Qaeda be in a weaker position than it is now. Most Iraqis have turned against al-Qaeda long ago. This Salafi Wahhabi ideology is not native to Iraq. It's not the common practice of Iraqi Sunnis. And the fact that al-Qaeda's come in with its ideology that Shia are infidel and not true Muslims and therefore have to be eliminated, that is not a popular concept among most Iraqi Sunnis. And when that ideology becomes violent and murderous and allows, encourages and promotes the planting of bombs in Shia mosques and Shia marketplaces and kills innocent victims, of course people are appalled and shocked by that. And that's why al-Qaeda now is very much on the ideological and physical defensive in Iraq. But once the Americans are going, and once it's known that the Americans are going, then al-Qaeda has absolutely no reason to be in Iraq. And the Iraqis will have a much more powerful position from which to say to al-Qaeda, you came in here, you said to liberate us from the Americans are now leaving, you go. you're foreigners as much as the Americans, so you leave. And then I think there's a much better chance that Iraqis can bridge this sectarian divide that's opened up only recently. There never was this sectarian divide before, at least at a political level, or at least in terms of the violence, as there has been in the last 3 years. So there's a much better chance that Iraqis can come together once this elephant leaves the room, because the Americans are the elephant in the room. Their presence distorts everything. Some people spend their time fighting them. Some people spend their energy blaming them. Some people, like the government of Iraq largely and the people around it, hide behind the Americans and look to them for some kind of protection. But they distort the entire politics of the country. So they have to go, and then I think there is a much better chance that Iraqis can come together politically, and some of these 4 million people who've lost their homes will have a chance of rebuilding their lives. Thank you.
Bravo. Well done.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll be opening the panel for the questions when all three speakers complete their short briefs. And now I ask George to start the session.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Chair, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, wa assalamu alaikum. Peace be on all of you. It is a pity that neither Mr. Sheikhli nor Mr. Alawi, both supporters of the war and invasion and occupation of their country, could be here, leaving the panel to 3 opponents of the invasion and occupation of their country. But perhaps when you've just heard, as you have, from one of Britain's most distinguished writers, the indictment of the invasion and occupation which they supported, you can understand that both gentlemen found good reasons not to be here despite having been advertised as being so. I hope I'm not being unkind, but I had looked forward very much to some stock taking 5 years on, after we said what we said and they said what they said, and now we all know what the actual outcome has been. Now, Jonathan Steele was too modest to plug his book, so let me plug it. His book, Defeat: How They Lost the War in Iraq, is an indispensable read for anyone interested, not only in the history of what has happened, but in the narrative of what is happening, and just as importantly, as a warning against that which they appear to be planning to happen, perhaps within days, weeks, or at most a few months from now, in relation to Iran. The other book which I've read in the last couple of weeks, which is indispensable reading, is by an American called Aram Roston. Now, Jonathan correctly lampooned the predisposition of Americans to blame the Iraqis for what's happened, but there is one Iraqi who is very much in the frame to be blamed for what's happened. And it's about him that this book is written. It's called The Man Who Pushed America into War: The Life and Extraordinary Times of Ahmad Chalabi, a relative of Mr. Alawi and a friend of Mr. Sheikhli. Perhaps another reason why they didn't come, because they perhaps had wind of the fact that I've been talking about this book all over town. This book demonstrates not only the extent of the forgery, lies, deception, and downright double and triple dealing in which the so-called Iraqi opposition was involved in London, in the run-up, in the years of the run-up to the war, but demonstrated too that the role of British journalists in that war is something which in history will be written edged in black or perhaps edged in blood red. Jonathan Steele was one of the few British journalists who told the truth and got it right about Iraq. But we must never forget the legion of British broadcasters and journalists and Newsnight, sandpit generals and pontificators who lied and lied and lied us into this disaster, and worse, lied the Iraqis in their hundreds of thousands into their graves. One in particular is a bête noire of mine and an erstwhile colleague of yours, a Mr. David Rose, who week after week produced scoop after scoop in the Observer newspaper and in Vanity Fair magazine, which he now tells us in this book he so bitterly regrets, he wonders if he can ever be a journalist again, because he was fooled, you see. This highly educated, top British journalist was fooled by Ahmed Chalabi and the liars and the forgers who led him into leading us into this disastrous pit, which is now Iraq. I mention it not just because I myself was on the receiving end many times in both publications of these fabrications by Mr. Rose, but because the British media is again marching us into war in relation to Iran. In the last day or two, the British media collectively went bananas about Iran test firing its own missiles on its own territory and announcing that if anyone should attack her, she has the means to defend herself. This was treated by the BBC as an act of aggression, worthy of condemnation by the so-called international community, who upon examination turned out to be exactly the same villains who lied us into the war with Iraq. So this subject is not just important because we need to know where we are and how we got there, but important to a proper evaluation of where our rulers now would like to take us and why we must oppose them. As the chair said in his introduction, I have a long history with Iraq, most of it outside of Iraq. In 1978, I was a founder member of the Campaign Against Repression and for Democratic Rights in Iraq. We were treated at the time as a group of communist troublemakers, disrupting the profitable relations between British and American governments and enterprise and the regime of Saddam Hussein. Despite the fact that I traveled the Arab world many times over, I did not visit Iraq before 1993. Though I had been traveling in the Arab world since the mid-1970s, I could not visit Iraq, for I would have been arrested if I had, as a known and vociferous opponent of the Saddam regime when, as Ihtisham was saying, British businessmen and governments were going in and out of the embassy, selling them guns, gas, and giving them the maps, the better to target them with. And these hypocrites now pray in aid the crimes of the Saddam regime, the vast majority of which were perpetrated on the Iraqi people when Saddam was Britain and America's best friend, as a justification for the slaughter of not just perhaps 1 million Iraqis in the war and occupation which has followed, not just the 2 million Iraqis now refugees many of them begging on the streets of Jordan and Syria. Not just the 2 million Iraqis who are now refugees inside their own country as a result of the sectarian ethnic cleansing carried out by who knows whom and on who knows behalf, but certainly entirely consistent with the policy of the occupier to divide and rule the people of Iraq, setting them against each other. There are people here from India, from the Indian subcontinent, who know that just a few tens of thousands of Britishers ruled a country of hundreds of millions of people entirely on the basis of dividing and ruling them on the basis of their religion, their caste, their confession. But the 1 million Iraqis, mainly children, who perished throughout the 1990s and early 2000s by the policy of sanctions, a soft word which means children dying for the want of essential medical equipment and essential food and other vital necessities. Iraq is a population of 22 million people. That's 1 million dead in the 90s, 1 million dead since the war began, 4 million refugees. That's 6 million people out of 22 million. If you made that comparison with our own population here in Britain, that would mean 15 million British people either dead or refugees as a result of a foreign intervention in our country. And they wonder why there's hatred. They wonder why they fan the flames of hatred and extremism around the world. They wonder why some Muslims want to blow themselves up in rage in the face of all of that. Now Anas is to speak, and his is the most authentic voice of all, as an Iraqi patriot who resisted all of this, notwithstanding his attitude to the previous regime in Baghdad. So I have only one more thing to say. And I've said it so often it's become a cliche, but not because it's no longer valid. The truth is that the criminals responsible for all of this are all still sitting in their places. The war cabinet, as was, with very few exceptions, remains the people who govern our country today. Chalabi is still in the government in Baghdad. Bush and Cheney remain with their finger on the trigger in the United States. This is not ancient history. These people who did all of this, who are responsible for all these deaths, not the least of whom are the British dead, young men sent to kill or be killed on a pack of lies. These criminals are still there. These journalists who were the fifth column for the invasion are still there, still pontificating. At least David Rose is ashamed of what he wrote. The others are now writing it all again. Wassalamu alaikum. Thank you very much indeed. Well done.
Thank you, George, for excellent introduction of the brief on the lies and the deception, and on top of that, what they are planning in terms of getting into Iran on the same basis of the lies and the deception. Now, I'd like to introduce the last speaker, Anas Al-Takriti.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends, Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you all. And it's an incredible pleasure having you all here today in this magnificent hall. And by the way, you may think that you know, the audience is quite thin, but I assure you, because of the enormity of the hall itself, we have a few hundred people, which is an incredible turnout for a Saturday afternoon or late morning when we have two main tube lines closed down and causing quite a lot of chaos for people wishing to be here. I also, as a director of Islam Expo, I also hope that you spend a few good hours, maybe even a couple more days here in Islam Expo, enjoying all the functions that we've held. It's also a great pleasure speaking alongside Jonathan Steele and George Galloway. The issue is extremely close to my heart, not only because of it's about the land which I love, which is embedded in my heart and in my soul and ingrained in my mind and everything that I do, but also because Iraq, over many years, has become a symbol for how wrong we can be, for how misguided we can be, and how catastrophic those, at best, blunders and at worst, crimes, how catastrophic the impact of them can also be. So it's also a humanitarian kind of perspective, rather than merely simply because I was born in Iraq 39 years ago and I care about simply because I'm Iraqi. I think that now as human beings, I think we can ill afford to disregard a catastrophe committed simply because we don't hail or we have no intrinsic connection with that particular land. I think that now the world is becoming smaller and smaller in terms of how people interact, how they engage with themselves, and a mistake or a blunder or a crime committed on any particular shore is bound to hit virtually every corner of the earth at some stage, sooner or later, sooner more often than later. Now, can I just first start off by stating a few facts about myself so that people can understand that I also come from a particular perspective. I have no grains about where I stand in regards with the previous regime. I think my point is clear on that. I think that no one has any doubt about where I stand on the war, the occupation, and the invasion and the subsequent invasion of Iraq. I think that most people who know me know exactly where I stand. But I'm also in an awkward position in that my father, who spent his entire life working for Iraq and was banished from his country for 33 years as a result of his position in regard with Iraq, is currently a member of the Iraqi parliament, which I often criticize and I lambast. I'm also quite on close terms and friendly terms with the current vice president of Iraq, Tariq al-Hashimi, whom I know to be quite a sincere person, although I don't vouch for his position or his endeavor or the path that he has chosen. So I also have an insight in the political spectrum and the problems going on there and the catastrophes being committed on a daily basis through those particular realms. Just so that I draw that kind of parallel and people can appreciate where I come from. It's not someone entirely from the outside attacking everything that's going on. I have loved ones and friends who are in the inside, the very institutes and establishments that I vehemently criticize and oppose. Now, I would suggest that we need to start addressing or rethinking or possibly even challenging the so-called, between inverted commas, facts. Because it is those facts that we are often told repeatedly through either an incredibly biased, and as George made out, a totally agenda-driven, power-controlled media. Often we ourselves, we fall victims. We start believing in some of the drivel being peddled time and time and time again. And for my Muslim brothers and sisters in the audience, we know this because whilst at 7, 8 years ago, we all collectively stood up and said, hang on, how do we define terrorists and terrorism? Now we are collectively, ourselves, we are standing up and saying, well, we actually condemn terrorism and terrorism on the very same terms identified by those whom we questioned in the first place, simply because it's been normalized. We have become normalized to the common debate, to the overwhelming repeating of certain terms, facts, and the such. So the very first thing I suggest we do is to start challenging those so-called facts. We need to start asking, where did this come from? And why? And why now? The very first facts that we were told and that led many people to believe that whilst they didn't like the idea of war, but maybe this is a good thing to do, was that first of all the Iraqi people wanted us to actually invade their country, hit them with all the military might that we can conjure, and then stay there just to check that everything is in place. We were told that the Iraqi people were actually begging us to do so. I was often told by friends of mine, colleagues of mine, people whom I met, that I'm here in London enjoying the luxury of the freedom and the lifestyle that I have over here, whilst my brothers and sisters are begging, to be released from the shackles that enslave them, that prevent them from enjoying something akin, similar to, on the same, kind of level that I enjoy. And that is so selfish of me. So the very first fact, or so-called fact, that we were told, and unfortunately many people bought into, including politicians, by the way, some well-meaning politicians who really were too lazy to think a little bit, harder, was that the fact that the Iraqi people wanted us to do what we did. The second so-called fact is that the Iraqi people are intrinsically, naturally divided. Now, I call upon all of you, whenever you encounter anyone making such a statement, that, well, what can we do about a country that has always been, for centuries, has been divided? Communities at loggerheads, at each other's necks, whom can only live in peace if ruled by a dictator, by someone who would, execute at whim and at will. That's the only time or place when the Iraqi people can actually live as civilized human beings. We need to challenge that. That is one of the greatest insults, in fact, the greatest crimes committed against the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people have been living in this mosaic. Today we celebrate the fact that we here in Britain have, this multicultural, diverse society. Why is it that this is something we ought to celebrate, whilst it's something bad and an impediment to civility in another country? It's absolutely ludicrous. The Iraqi people have been living according to this particular mosaic, all faiths, all religions, all communities, all sects if you wish, all racial and ethnic identities, living on this particular land for centuries. Why is it that all of a sudden now we have people blowing themselves up and killing others? Why is it that now we have this sectarian violence? Why is it that now people are seeking others out simply because of what kind of religion they belong to, or which family they're fellows of, or the such? Why is it that it's just happened now? Isn't the timing a little bit conspicuous? So the fact that the Iraqi people are divided is a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. And I often state certain facts and figures, and to be honest, I don't want to really go on about this, because it's sort of, when you keep on talking about something, you make it as though it's true. But there are thousands upon thousands of couples, of families built upon a Sunni father and a Shiite mother, or vice versa. Muslims married to Christians and Jews, countless families who have children. How would you classify? I'm from Tikrit. Tikrit is naturally an Arab Sunni town where most people are Arabs and Sunnis. But in my family alone, my uncle, my maternal uncle, my direct uncle is married to a Shia woman. How do you classify their children? Are they Sunni or Shia? My aunt, my paternal aunt, she's married to a Shia doctor. How do you classify their children? My own cousins. Thousands upon thousands of families are built upon the celebration that Iraq is diverse. So the fact that, we have this problem because Iraq is made up of Muslims and Christians and Jews and other religions and faiths, and that within Islam alone we have the Sunnis and Shias, and within the Sunnis we have this and this. That is a lie. Yes, there is that kind of mosaic, but it's a mosaic to be celebrated rather than to cite as a reason why the country should suffer such violence. The other is that there is this element, and if I'm trying to put this in as much as polite words as I can, but it's very difficult. A few weeks ago, and I was just telling George, I was on American radio. I'm not sure which one, to be honest. They have so many, letters scattered about, and you can't for the life of you decipher what they mean. But I was on radio over the phone, and there was an American chap from a research center in America, and we were talking about what I will come to mention in a little bit, the SOFA. It's an agreement, the security agreement between Iraq and America that now some are trying to peddle and to promote. And imagine, after citing all the problems that have occurred in Iraq over the past 5.5 years, where Iraq was and where it became, imagine, what the response came from the American chap on the other side. He said, well, you shouldn't blame the American government or the American forces for this. The Iraqi people should have been more grateful and should have accepted the state of affairs, and if they had, by now, Iraq would have been one of the most developed countries in the region. So basically what this gentleman was asserting, and by the way, I may cite him, but this is by no means some sort of marginal, peripheral kind of view. This is something that many politicians buy into, and in fact, some actually use this as their doctrine. That not only do we have the right as the most powerful nation to invade and occupy countries at will, but the occupied must not only accept but celebrate the fact that we are occupying them. Have you seen a more obscene, a more insulting, a more offensive doctrine than that? But that is exactly the kind of situation that the Iraqis have to confront. That they are not only under occupation, but they have to be absolutely happy about it, and they have to be grateful for it. And that is the only way out for them to then rebuild their country and live in prosperity. And that is absolutely ludicrous. So the very first point I'd like to make is that we need to challenge the so-called facts. I'll be done in a couple of minutes, Ehtisham. The other thing is that we have to realize, and as George mentioned very briefly, history did not start after 9/11. Unfortunately, we have politicians and journalists and writers who have very short memories. History did not start with 9/11. Way before 9/11, and way before anyone had heard about Al-Qaeda, or those who have knew it to be a very small marginal element. I remember till now, around the late 90s, in my local mosque where I go to pray, people, after Friday prayers would be selling on rugs on, the pavement, selling audio tapes with Osama bin Laden's speeches and the such, and they were going for about 30p. And there were no buyers. Seriously, I mean, these people would, essentially they were there, people knew about them, but they were a non-entity. They were irrelevant. Now, the fact is that Iraq has been through more than 2 to 3 decades of incredible, inhumane, tragic treatment, dealt primarily by ourselves here in the West. George mentioned the fact that during the 90s, when an economic embargo and sanctions were imposed on Iraq in 1990, people forget seemingly that over the subsequent 13 years until the war, more than 1 million children perished as a result of those economic sanctions. The greatest gift you can send to an Iraqi, and I had family and friends over there, people whom we used to speak to on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis if communications allowed, who had, the greatest gift you can offer them is some antibiotics, simply because there weren't any. I remember very well sending a package, and it was very difficult getting it through. You had to smuggle it in, essentially. Sending a package of syringes and bandages simply because we had a relative who needed surgery, but basically the hospital would say, well, you need to bring your own syringes and bandages. We never got to hear about these things. By the way, they're all documented and published by the UN. Very, very extremely rich and very, very impressive looking reports every year published by the UN. Really, statistics, data, charts, everything is there. Read them throughout, from 1991 till 2004. Those UN reports, they talk, they put into pictures and in facts and figures the crimes committed as a result of the sanctions that we partook in implementing in Iraq. Unfortunately, the cost for all those research and everything, that was taken out from Iraq. It was part of the debt that was accumulating against Iraq. Again, something that very few people know about. So when people come to ask, why are the Iraqi people so ungrateful? It's not because, for some reason they are genetically created to hate the Americans or the Brits or everyone who happens to have a white complexion. That's ridiculous. It's simply because we have been battering them for so long, either through supporting oppressive regimes, or then by imposing sanctions, killing their loved ones, or then ending it by hitting them with one of the most fierce wars in recent memory, and by an occupation that is so brutal, it's very difficult to talk about. Let me finish with this. Iraq currently, after 5.5 years, on the UN list of countries that are rated in terms of their transparency or corruption, is slightly better than Somalia and Myanmar. It lies third from bottom. And we're talking about a country that is overlooked by American supervision, American bodies, American corporates and companies. The most corrupt government on earth is currently in Iraq. If you heard a few weeks ago, the oil law that had to be by constitution, which was again drafted in America, by constitution had to be ratified by Parliament, and Parliament would not sit or would not ratify it for known reasons. It was essentially passed by the government. They just simply started selling off Iraqi oil sector bit by bit, as you would do to a shank of a lamb leg on a Sunday, how you would cut some pieces and put those pieces in various plates. The same is happening today as we speak to the oil sector that was nationalized more than 35 years ago in Iraq. Now it's being given to certain corporates and companies. Why? Simply because the current political structure is based on parties that own. They're not there to be accountable. They own parts of Iraq. They were given parts of Iraq in order to buy into the American plan, and therefore they have to be rewarded. And their reward was to commission part of the oil sector to foreign companies, particularly to the American companies, oil companies and the oil and petroleum industry in America. And those are being sold off for immense, humongous commissions and for long-term contracts. So basically Iraq and the Iraqi people will not have the pleasure of enjoying their oil, which is essentially the third largest reservoir in the entire world, for the next 35 years, to say the very least. When we talk about Iraqi debts, Iraq shouldn't have any debts at all. With the oil prices that we have, with the price of a barrel of petrol hitting the $150 mark, Iraq should be able to pay off all its debts and more within a year if it was left to its own means, but it shouldn't. And that's why we go back to exactly why this war was waged. I don't want to carry on for any longer. I've taken more than I should, but hopefully in the questions and answers that we will have, we will be able to complete the picture, which is unfortunately coming from the title, Iraq after 5 years, chaos or stability, I'm really saddened to say that it has nothing to do, not even close to do with any resemblance of stability at all. It is entire chaos, and a chaos that unfortunately we are part of creating. Shukran. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Anas. I think that he reflected the bleeding hearts of every Iraqi child, woman, and men in different parts of Iraq. So you couldn't have asked for a better panel today if you really want to know about what is going on inside Iraq. A senior journalist, a great politician, and an Iraqi. So now I open the panel to direct the questions to any of the speakers on the subjects, the issues they raised, or anything else related to the subject today. Please. The man with the blue shirt and the jacket.
Assalamu alaikum. May I just say that I agree with much of what the panelists have said. Very distinguished men in their fields. I guess it's a two-pronged question. One about the removal of U.S. troops from Iraq. You said that needs to happen before anything positive goes ahead. What do you say then to the elected government then in Iraq, though there are many questions about them, imploring the Americans to stay for as much as is needed, and they seek to improve the security of the country? I guess the second part of my question is, though the Americans, the British coalition forces that have gone in are not beyond reproach, and they do deserve a lot of criticism for what they've received, and you have criticized them very effectively. I find it a bit distressing that you've ignored the main cause of the horrible murders that are still going on, the explosions of wedding parades and suicide bombings that are continuing over there that have nothing to do with the Americans. They're being carried out by Al-Qaeda, by ISI, by a number of groups that have agendas in Iraq. Why have you omitted criticism of these people who are the true murderers, who are the ones who are carrying out the major atrocities? Now, though, as I said, the Americans are not beyond reproach, the major atrocities are being carried out by the Al-Qaeda, the suicide bombings of children, of wedding processions. So why have you not criticized them as much as they surely do deserve? Thank you.
I like to direct are you directing the question to any particular panelist? Okay. First half, if Jonathan can take on that.
Well, let me deal with the first part of the question first. The Iraqi government, as Anas has pointed out, is made up of people who are in a very difficult position, because at some level they are nationalists, at other levels they are under the thumb of the United States. They virtually chose Nouri al-Maliki to be Prime Minister when they announced that the previous Prime Minister, Ibrahim Jafari, was unacceptable. And Jack Straw, who was then Foreign Secretary here, and Condoleezza Rice actually went to Baghdad, and I was in the Prime Minister's office in a side room when they told him, your time is up, you must go. And 2 weeks later he resigned. So these people are partly nationalists and partly puppets, and they're in a very difficult position. But on this question of the Status of Forces Agreement, and which would legitimize, quotes unquotes, the extended presence of the United States, they're in a particularly difficult position, because that has to be put to the Iraqi parliament. The Bush people are saying, we're not going to put it to the Senate in the United States. But the Iraqis are saying, no, we're Democrats. We're going to have to put it to our parliament. And it's highly unlikely, I think, that it will actually get through parliament. It'll be very, very difficult. They may have to bribe people virtually to pass it, because the nationalism is rising in Iraq among the politicians. Even after 5 years, people are getting impatient. And it's not at all clear that the Americans will get this agreement, at least in the language that they want. They've already had to make some concessions, for example, that the foreign contractors will now be subject to Iraqi law. In the past, if foreign contractors murdered people, shot them, or whatever, there was no legal process for getting any kind of justice. Now that will have to come to Iraqi courts. So it is a complex thing. On your second point, I'm not sure whether you were here at the beginning when I was speaking, but I spoke for several minutes about Al-Qaeda and their atrocities, and pointing out that they are responsible for the most gruesome murders, particularly of Shia, although they are now attacking the Sunni so-called Awakening al-Sahwa movement in Anbar province, because they consider them to be collaborators and traitors and so on. So I did mention Al-Qaeda, but the crucial point is, why is Al-Qaeda in Iraq? Dick Cheney and a lot of the American public may think that Al-Qaeda was in Iraq in 2003 before the invasion, but it wasn't. Saddam Hussein, as a secular Arab leader, even though he in the last 10 years tried to pretend he was a bit of an Islamist, it was phony. He had no dealings with Al-Qaeda, and they didn't want to have any dealings with him either. It was a mutual antipathy. But Al-Qaeda's only come into Iraq because of the American presence. And so that's why I say the crucial issue is to get the Americans out. Then it'll be easier to get Al-Qaeda out. The Americans try and put the thing the other way around, saying, no, we have to get rid of Al-Qaeda. We're in there to defeat Al-Qaeda. You're not. You are the magnet that brought Al-Qaeda in. So the Americans have to get out first. And I certainly agree with you that Al-Qaeda's been responsible for atrocities, and I did mention it.
Thank you. Now,
May I briefly? Thank you, Ihtisham. I tend to the puppet theory so far as the regime in Baghdad is concerned, and the reason they want American forces to stay is not for the security of Iraq, but for the security of themselves. Because most of them arrived in Baghdad, metaphorically speaking, on the back of an American tank, and will have to leave Baghdad on the back of an American tank, or perhaps helicopter like the stooge Vietnamese did from the roof of the US Embassy in Saigon more than a quarter of a century ago. The second point I think that needs to be made, and this is more controversial perhaps, is to ask the question of who's responsible for these atrocities to which you refer, which begs the further question of who is Al-Qaeda. You're a younger man than me, so you can be forgiven for not knowing or remembering just how Al-Qaeda came to be, how Osama bin Laden came to be. And he came to be as an agent of the United States imperialist intervention in Afghanistan. Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan armed and financed and helped coordinate the campaign of the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan, of which Osama bin Laden was a significant part, and the people we now come to know as the Taliban are the spiritual, at least in some cases actual, sons of those that Britain and America armed and sent into Afghanistan in the first place. So it's not to be a conspiracy theorist to ask the question, who is bin Laden and who is he working for? We know who he used to work for. We know that many actions that are taken and claimed in his name actually serve the interests not of the Muslims, but of those who wish to destroy the Muslims. This we know. Now, you don't have an excuse for not having read The Quiet American by Graham Greene. If you had, you'd know that some of the worst atrocities apparently carried out by the Viet Cong in Vietnam were in fact carried out as black propaganda operations by the American occupiers and their stooge regime in Vietnam. If you haven't read it, I commend it to you, or even watch the movie with Michael Caine, where there's a vivid depiction of just such an operation. I don't know who is carrying out these sectarian atrocities in Iraq, but I'm not prepared to accept the word of the very liars who took us into Iraq in the first place, at least without the closest possible examination. What I do know is that these actions serve the interests of the occupier and the case of the occupier to remain. And therefore, these actions are anti-Iraqi and against the resistance. And it's often useful, I've discovered in my life, to ask the Latin question, cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from these atrocities? You got mixed up when you mentioned the ISI. They're, of course, if they're active anywhere in Afghanistan rather than Iraq. But I'll give you an intelligence service that is active in Iraq by their own admission, and that's the Israeli intelligence service. The Israelis arrived in Baghdad within hours of the fall of Baghdad. That's a matter of fact that they openly talk about in their own press and media, and many commentators in Israel talk about their time joyfully spent in occupied Baghdad. So, I say that the withdrawal of the occupation from Iraq is not a guarantee that there will be peace and stability in Iraq. But the failure to withdraw the occupation from Iraq will guarantee a continued future of instability and bloodshed.
Thank you, George. Now I'm going to take three questions from three people before I put onto the panel, but please introduce yourself and be brief on your question, and if possible, direct to the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to add another example to George's, as if another one were necessary. During the build-up to the Iraq War, there was something else happening in Northern Ireland. Of course, you will know that there was a struggle in Northern Ireland for freedom for the last 30 years. During the build-up to the Iraq War and after it, a woman called Nuala O'Lone was involved with investigation into collusion between the British security forces and terrorist elements in Northern Ireland. And I think these things happened 15, 20, and 25 years ago, but they did most certainly happen. And when you hear about very similar things happening in Iraq or happening in Afghanistan, it's very easy simply to look at what happened in the north of Ireland and say, well, of course, they learned these lessons there. They learned to collude with loyalist terrorists. They learned to murder Catholics and then to blame it on the IRA in order to discredit them. Those are the lessons that they learned in Northern Ireland, in a place that is actually part of Britain. You get some sense of what the British, what the Americans, and what the Israelis might be willing to do, and probably have done in Iraq and Afghanistan to stir up sectarian tension and to try and limit the scope for Iraqis to resist occupation. But my question to the platform is, the war on terror has been a failure in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It will become increasingly clear that it's been a failure in Afghanistan. Why then are they spreading the war on terror to Somalia, to Kenya, and now we hear yesterday in The Independent they want to spread it to Nigeria, incidentally another very oil-rich country. I'd like to know what the platform thinks about the spreading of the war on terror.
Thank you. If you get the microphone to the lady over here in this corner and the gentleman next with the jacket, the grey jacket. The corner.
Assalamu alaikum. I think it's about time that we stopped falling into the trap of believing that there is such a thing as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was established by the United States and Mossad, and nothing on earth is going to make me believe otherwise. Nothing. You talk about the terrorist attacks that are happening in Iraq, throughout Iraq. Do you know what the American mercenaries, for instance, are doing to the Iraqi people? There are mercenaries in Iraq. You've got Blackwater, a security company owned by Iraq, and these people are on video using Iraqi citizens as target practice and laughing at it. So there is nothing on earth that you will ever convince me that Iraqis are killing Iraqis. And as for the government that they have in Iraq, the government we have is a treacherous government. It is working for the United States. It's working for United States interest. America, in fact, has bought 100% of all Iraqi companies. And then Israel is involved in Iraq up to its teeth. It's opening up the oil pipes to Haifa at the expense of everybody else.
Sorry.
So I want people to stop accepting the fact that Al-Qaeda exists. It does not exist, and Iraq needs its independence.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The gentleman in the middle.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Ufuk Seçkin. I'm the vice chairman of Islamic Community of Milli Görüş, an organization headed up by Professor Dr. Necmettin Erbakan, the former Prime Minister of Turkey, who was boosted from his office through a modern military coup. I would like to thank the panelists for the excellent description of the current status in Iraq and also the past 5 years. My question is to all of the panelists, could you please describe or possible scenarios of the future, what the situation will be like in 5, 10, 15 years in Iraq? The gentleman, Jonathan Steele, said first the American occupation must end, so the violence ends. But what does it actually mean in detail? What are the steps which are needed so we get a sovereign Iraqi government and a country? Is it going to split up in 3 sections, what probably is the preferred option by many people in the US and British government? Thank you.
One more question. The young lady here in the front.
Assalamu alaikum. I just think it's very naive and actually quite undermining and very disrespectful to put all the blame 100% on America. While America have triggered the insurgency in Iraq, at the end of the day, the reality of the fact is Iraqis are killing Iraqis in Iraq. I've had members from my own family killed in suicide bombs in Iraqi mosques, in Shia areas, in Shia marketplaces, in weddings, in funerals, and to sit there and deny that the fact that this is happening is something completely, it just goes over my head and I don't understand 100%.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, if Anas want to take the first question on.
I'd like to respond to our friend from the Milli Görüş. First of all, his question regarding the scenario for the future. It's very difficult to see where Iraq will be, not in 5, 10, 15 years, in 5 months' time. Simply because the events that are taking place within Iraq, as well as outside Iraq, are very fluid and they're moving all the time, and every single day signals something else. By the way, I just wanted to come to something and just to comment on something that George said in his answer to the previous question. It's quite ironic and quite amusing to find that virtually every single Iraqi politician, and Jonathan, who's observing the political scene in Iraq, may also correct me here, every single Iraqi politician today, whether in government or in parliament, every single one of them now is basically repeating the mantra that we want a timetable for the withdrawal of the American troops. Every single politician. There is not one single politician in Iraq that openly says, actually, no, we want the Americans to stay. Not one single politician. And personally, my explanation for this is exactly what George said, and that is that people can see the end. And they're afraid of what is going to happen after the end. And there are many, many people who have put their entire reputations, their characters, their personalities, and they bet them all on the success of the American project. And they can see how that particular project is dismantling, it's collapsing, it's vanishing, and they can see that they will have very little standing in a future Iraq. In fact, we have seen dozens of Iraqi politicians. One of them, the most high profile and the one we've heard about, is, for instance, the Iraqi health minister. who, by the way, officially still is the Iraqi health minister. Last year, he fled to America. He went on an official visit, and then he just fled his plane and claimed asylum status in America. And now he's in Washington. He has a very nice house, I take it, outside Washington, D.C., and he's living there simply because he cannot return to Iraq. That is the state of not just, a few, but an entire catalogue of politicians who have staked their reputation on the American project. However, what I would say is that many bad things may happen to Iraq. I'm not, rejecting the possibility that Iraq may be broken up into a few segments, that there will be further power offered to the occupying force, and they may establish permanent bases, and they may take full control of the oil sector and all that. However, what I do have very little doubt of is the fact that we do this and we continue this particular line tying up to the question about the war on terror to our detriment. To our detriment. And I'm not talking about just the detriment of the Iraqi people, because it seems that very few people outside of the region really care of the welfare of the Iraqi people. It's, what is best for us? What is our exit strategy? Not for the sake of Iraq, it's for the sake of us. We do this at our peril. We are going to suffer. The credit crunch that is now rippling through the world, and people are seeing, the prices of their own assets and properties diminish and plummet, and their own savings being lost in thin air, in ether, to no one knows who. This is merely one side effect of what we are doing around the world. The wars, the chaos, the bloodshed, the violence. Climate change. I mentioned this a few times before. I was once attacked by a co-panelist when I mentioned the fact that I had just returned from Jordan and then I had gone to somewhere else, and he said, Anas, you seem to be caring very little about the environment. Do you know how significant your carbon footprint is on the planet? And I said to him, have you ever given a thought to the carbon footprint, to the wars being waged on Iraq and in Afghanistan and possibly now in Iran? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tons of fire and steel dropped from high air onto lands in Iraq and Afghanistan and many other countries every single year. But that carbon footprint, you see, we're not told about. We lambast and blame old ladies for turning on their lights for more than they need to be, or for brushing your teeth while the water tap is on. And that, by the way, is wrong, and you shouldn't. However, I think that we are not blaming the real culprits in who is affecting the environment and really destroying the planet in this particular. Now, just finally, my sister here, who spoke about her view and her own experience and plight in Iraq. No one here, neither Jonathan or George or myself, ever denied the fact that yes, these attacks are happening and are taking place. Of course they are. Of course they are. But what we try to explain is why have these attacks taken place? What is the root cause for these people to be even inside Iraq? I know, for my entire life, I never got to live in Iraq. I left Iraq when I had to leave Iraq when I was 1 year old, and I lived my entire life as in exile. And I was against the Iraqi regime. However, I have no recording whatsoever of those brutal years, those 35 years of the brutal Ba'ath regime. I have never ever recorded or read about a single Iraqi ever being involved in any terrorist attack anywhere around the world. I have never ever read or heard about a single suicide attack happening in Iraq under the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein. Why is it only that all of a sudden Iraq has become the hotbed of Al-Qaeda, the hotbed of suicide bombers, the hotbed of terrorists since 2003? Why is that? I ask. And that's the very concept that we've been trying to address, that yes, there will be horrible things, there will be horrible people taking grip, but you opened a can of worms. Who did that? Who is essentially responsible? And that is why I stake my claim here and say, yes, those people who kill others innocently, who kill their brothers and sisters, are criminals, no doubt. But they did what they did under the guise and under the watch of the Americans, and that is why I hold them, as well as my own government, responsible.
Thank you. the pastoral questions. Jonathan or George want to come in?
Me? Well, a number of points. I don't think we can deal with them all, but I certainly would agree with the lady here who did say that unfortunately Iraqis are killing Iraqis. It's foolish to deny it, I think. I mean, I remember hearing when these first bombs began, some people even saying to me, Muslims don't kill other Muslims. I mean, we have to face the fact the truth is ugly, and these things do happen. People are people, and they get very emotional, and they get very angry, and they do these things. And to pretend that somehow it's all from outside, and it's all Westerners, and not being done by Iraqis or by people who call themselves Al-Qaeda, who I think are not under the control of the Americans, then I think we don't really get anywhere near a correct analysis. You see, it's easy to say, well, it's all Al-Qaeda's fault, or to say the Al-Qaeda doesn't exist and it's the special forces doing dirty tricks. It's much more honest, I think, to say it could be both. Yeah. Why does it have to be one or the other? Why couldn't it be some dirty tricks being done by the CIA or Mossad or whatever it is? Yes, they try and exploit these situations, but why can't we also say, yes, it is other bodies like Al-Qaeda, which we know has an ideology which is very much against the Shia, and there are a large number of Shia in Iraq who now are the dominant force politically. It would be foolish to imagine that Al-Qaeda wouldn't be tempted to come in now that they've been given this opportunity by the foolish and illegal and unnecessary invasion of Iraq by the Americans and the British. But on the very good question that somebody said about what would the future be in 5 years' time, a really challenging question, and I think we're all hesitating to find an answer because, of course, we can't look into the future and be sure. And we don't want to be too negative and too pessimistic. But I think I would just point to two optimistic things. I'm not sure how you weigh them entirely in the balance and whether they would outweigh all the pessimistic things that could happen. But the two optimistic things are first to do with the breakup of the country. It's not a majority view in the Shia Iraqi community to have a breakup of the country. A lot of people, analysts from outside, particularly in the United States, but also in this country, say, yes, the Shia want to break up the country, they want the oil of the southeast and so on, and they're moving forward. Sometimes they add under the influence of Iran, which would like to break up Iraq and have a weak neighbor instead of a relatively strong neighbor. That is not true. It's only one strong group, admittedly, but only one group in the Shia community, Sikh, Supreme Islamic Iraqi Council of Abdulaziz Hakim, the Hakim family, which have come out for this idea of a regional autonomy for the south, which would eventually lead to the breakup of the country. The other group, Fadila, Virtue Group, which runs Basra, the governor, is in favor of Basra becoming separate, not the whole of the southeast. But the Muqtada al-Sadr people are against that, and they, I think, are the dominant force in the Shia community. Muqtada is an Iraqi nationalist. He's firmly come out against the occupation from the very first day that it started. That is one of the reasons why he's so popular. Not the only one, but one of the main reasons why he's popular is he is a nationalist. He says we want a unified, strong Iraq that we run ourselves and that foreigners don't run, whether it's the Al-Qaeda or whether it's the Americans or the Iranians. And so the dominant force in the Shia community is not in favor of breakup. And I think there's no sign that Muqtada is losing popularity or support. And so I think this idea of a breakup is not going to happen. There are people who would like it to happen. The Kurds, I think, would be quite happy if it did happen, because they would then think that they would be a step forward towards total independence, and they could bring in the Kurds of Iran and Syria and Turkey as well. So I think there is optimism there about this breakup theory. Secondly, the other thing is sectarian violence. I like to use the medical analogy of a cancer. This cancer of Sunni Shia hostility is new. It's only just infected the body politic of Iraq. Of course, people were Sunni and were Shia, and they worshipped in a different way, and they prayed in a different way, and they had different religious days that were special to them. But it wasn't politically relevant. as Anas has already pointed out, there were hundreds of mixed marriages and so on. People at university didn't worry whether their friends, or even think whether their friends were Sunni or Shia in their workplace or wherever they were, or their neighbors. It's a new thing that's been injected into the situation, this idea that that's the primary issue about your life, is whether you're Sunni or Shia, and you can't trust the people who are on the other side. That's all new. It's a cancer that's been developed. And let's not forget that when these first atrocities did begin, the first bombings of the Shia mosques, and even the Samarra Golden Dome bombing of that shrine, the Ayatollah Sistani and the other leaders of the Shia community said, don't take revenge on our Sunni brethren. We're all Muslims, we're all Iraqis. Sunni Shia is not relevant. Don't fall into this trap of taking revenge. Similarly, the Sunni imams made the same message when their people came under attack. And there were joint funerals where the Sunni imams took part alongside the Shia clergy for these funerals of these innocent victims of these terrible bombings. So it was a politically responsible and religiously responsible leaders took a very, very sensible line. But of course, there came a point when the amount of killing reached a level that they lost control, basically. And people like Sistani and the Sunni imams lost control, and people took the law into their hands. There was no justice, there is no justice, and so people want to get revenge. And you can understand that, however much it is a sad and tragic element of the situation. But the political leaders and the religious leaders were then and still are against this sectarian division. And so I think that once that elephant leaves the room, once we know that the Americans are going, the Iraqis are once again going to be in charge of their country, I hope, and this is the optimistic point, I hope that the religious and political leadership on both sides of the Sunni-Shia divide will come together and say, look, this is a new thing in our society. It is a cancer. We can cut it out. It is not yet fatal. We're not doomed. If we work together, we can rebuild this country when it is our country. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. We are fast running out of time, and George will be making a point on this. Then I'll be heading for just one last question from a gentleman on this middle panel.
Thank you, Ihtisham. I appreciate that, because I do want to respond to two at least of the questions, and my apologies to the other. Actually, I don't have time, you don't have time for me to adumbrate why, but I think that the attack on the Samarra Mosque was almost certainly a black operation carried out deliberately to create what it did create, which was a wave of sectarian killing and ethnic cleansing. I believe that the attack on the Samarra Mosque was carried out by agents of the occupation. Doesn't mean they weren't Iraqis, but they were agents of the occupation, carrying out the policy of the occupation. Equally, there have been atrocities by the score, maybe by the 100, that were undoubtedly carried out for sectarian reasons, mainly but not exclusively by Salafists from outside Iraq, but also including Salafists inside Iraq, against marketplaces and mosques, and have been disgusting examples of sectarian hatred. And I agree with Jonathan. There's no reason why this has to be viewed through an either-or prism. But as I said to Tony Blair in what has now become a reasonably well-known conversation in the House of Commons corridor outside the Gentleman's Library just a couple of weeks before the war, and here I'm assuming that there is an Al-Qaeda, which I believe there is. My only question is who it's working for. And of course, who it's working for is not necessarily known to the people who are carrying out the work. But I said to Mr. Blair, there is no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But if you invade and occupy it, there will be thousands of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that's precisely what has happened. Now, the gentleman asked what's likely to happen in 10, 15 years. And this links to the question raised by the gentleman on my left about the spreading of this war on terror. I'm very optimistic about Iraq. I never visited Iraq before 1993, but I came to know the Iraqi people very, very well. That's why I confidently predicted before the war everything that's happened since in terms of the resistance to foreign occupation. I am in no doubt of two things. First of all, that Iraq will not break up into three parts. It may break up into two, although the other countries round about will have something to say about that, including your own as a Turkish gentleman. It may very well be that the Kurdish north of the country will never again be part of a unified Iraq. But that the Iraqi Sunni and Shia Arabs will remain as one country, I'm absolutely convinced about that. Secondly, I'm absolutely convinced that the occupation and their comprador in the puppet regime in Baghdad and all the mercenaries and others who've been attracted like flies to the carcass of what was Iraq will be driven out. What timescale can not only not be predicted down to months, as Anas said, almost it can't be predicted down to days. Let me give you just one example. If there's an attack on Iran in the next few weeks or months, the consequences for Iraq are incalculable. Because if there's an attack on Iran, Iran will respond as she must and has every right to everywhere. And who made Iran powerful in Iraq? We did. And she will use the power that she has in Iraq, and who can blame her? To strike back an aggression against her by the United States and or its surrogate Israel. Now think of what that might look like. There are 5,000 British soldiers holed up in the airport at Basra, unfortunately not yet in the departure lounge, surrounded by millions of Iraqi Shiites, where there are thousands upon thousands of Iranians, including Iranian political organizations, and hundreds of millions of Iraqis who are influenced by sympathy for Iran. What's that going to look like? Did you ever see the film Zulu? Well, it will be like that, but without the happy ending, so far as the British were concerned. Now, if there's an attack on Iran, Iraq may quickly become uncontrollable. Perhaps Muqtada and his people will rejoin the insurrection. Perhaps the Sunni resistance groups that have recently left the field will return to the field. Perhaps Iraq will become uncontrollable very soon, much sooner than any of us know. So we can't predict, because of the spreading wildfire that's going on, when it will happen. But of this I'm sure. Just as I was sure that one day the American ambassador would scramble onto his helicopter in Saigon and take off with the puppet regime clinging to the wheels of the aircraft as it took off. They will leave Iraq just as they were forced to leave Vietnam by the wrath of the Iraqi people.
Thank you, George. Unfortunately, that we have overshot our time given to this panel, and I hope that you all really enjoyed this excellent the speakers with deep insight on Iraq issues in different perspectives. And I'd like to thank you all for your time on this panel, and thanks once again the speakers for making their way and the time to be among with us on this event. We are concluding this session, and just like to do the announcement, the next session is Do Muslim Women Need Liberating? It's promising to be a very interesting topic, so please stay on and continue with it. Thank you.
عطشان عطشان في قلبي بيندم يا أرق من نسمة